You're lying in bed at night, looking emptily at your phone. You really don't want to look at it. You have no real memory of why you started looking at it or what you were looking for. Why the hell am I doing this? After you fall asleep, you find yourself sinking in the ocean. You sink to the point where you cannot go any lower because you've been pushed into the ocean floor. The weight of the ocean is trying to push you down further, but down is no longer a viable option. You start moving sideways. You change. You hear the alarm clock go off. You set it on snooze. Not again. It goes off again. Isn't the main truck higher than the kelson is low? As Melville wrote about this idea that it isn't a coincidence that ships are, relatively speaking, more above the water than they are below, implying that positive has more to it than negative. What a stupid idea. The alarm clock goes off again. It's time to go to work. I'm not a negative person when it comes to work. When I go to work, I bring a positivist mindset. I put on my professional face. I stay on subject in the meetings, laugh with people in the lunchroom, don't participate in slander, back-talking on bosses or colleagues. Work is going to get done, so why not do it in the best way? But that doesn't mean that there aren't negative things with work. There are always negative things with work. I just finished a project that lasted 6 years, and I waited till now to talk about everything that was wrong with it. I kept my mouth shut all these years, lurking in the shadows, psychologically speaking. But first, as a warm-up, I'm going to talk about a failed hobby project that lasted just a few weeks and involved only myself. 2-week project failure. Do you know that feeling when you have an idea for a hobby project, like building a porch, a garden improvement, or a website? At first, you have doubts. Do I really have the time? But the idea keeps coming back, and you feel more and more that you have to do it. Finally, you take the first step. I'm going to do it. As you go through several cycles of these hobby projects, you realize that sometimes the initial idea for the project wasn't all that good. Even though you felt this frenzy in the beginning, the project eventually runs out of steam for reasons that aren't at first apparent. Here's the failed hobby project that I'm going to talk about. The Great Wave of Kanagawa is a 19th century painting created by Hokusai. It depicts a stormy sea and a freak wave, and these boats that are trying to survive. Pay attention to these white foam areas. The lip of the waves, these regions, move too fast to stay on top of the water below. So this water goes airborne and it transforms from blue water into this white foam. For this project, I asked myself, is it possible to animate this painting? There are 2 things that make this painting interesting for an animation. The first thing is that the water is only made up of 4 colors, 2 types of white and 2 types of blue. So color selection is not much of an issue. The second thing are these fractal-looking shapes of the breaking waves. Writing the code to recreate this type of fractal function would be a lot of fun. But before one can start doing that, one needs to do a lot of work on when and how a wave breaks. So I began by looking at some related work, and nobody has really got that far. In video games these days, water looks pretty good, like Sea of Thieves. And turns out they use the same type of water equations that were used in movies like Titanic from '97. They're called Gerstner waves, and the nice thing about them is that they're very efficient to compute. But you never see animations of breaking waves with this technique. For breaking waves, there isn't that much out there. There are some papers and some obscure coastal engineering and a Blender project here and there. The way these projects compute breaking waves is by using finite element methods, the Navier-Stokes equations, and smooth particle hydrodynamics. The reason they're not being used widely is because they're really expensive to compute. Like, it takes way too much time to run these computations in a video game, and it doesn't even look that great. So here was my initial chain of thought. It's probably really difficult to do this well. There's a lack of good animations of breaking waves. The bar isn't that high. If I spend a couple of weeks on it, it may not look that good, but at the very least I'll probably learn something. Turns out there was something to learn from it. The art of project failure. Perhaps subconsciously, I was just curious in learning why it's so difficult. Perhaps the darker side of me really wanted to explore failure itself, to see myself fail. We all have these internal yin-yang battles. It's not that far-fetched that our subconscious sometimes wants to see us fail at something that our consciousness wants to succeed at. So I was thinking that one can use Gerstner waves as a fundament and then make waves break on top of them somehow. I'd say it's still an open question whether that is a good idea or even makes sense. All I can say is that it's a heck of a lot harder than I originally thought, and I spent a whole week adding and tuning parameters to get closer to it. You know that feeling late at night when you feel like you're close to success and you add code to these functions that just objectively start looking too long, but because you feel close, you don't clean them up, and you also don't feel like it because you're not sure you will actually end up using these functions. Basically, this is just scripting, or explorative coding. You're getting deeper and deeper into some random rabbit hole. You know it, but you don't want to admit it, until you run into a bug a few weeks later. Then you find yourself looking at some shit-looking code, and have no idea what it does. For this project, I eventually felt like the whole code base was sick. A big nail in the coffin came when I ran into a wall on the technical side. The easiest explanation that I can think of is that the Gerstner waves cannot be made to look really big in one place, without making them look equally big somewhere else. Thing is, for an animation of a freak wave, what you actually want is for the wave to be really big in a specific place, and small everywhere else. As I was giving up, I started looking more and more at the alternative ways, using these finite particle methods. This guy, for example. The last time I was thinking about respawning my project, I was thinking that I was going to steal these neat-looking functions, plug them into my project. But then I looked at his repository. What is this? Under the hood, I sensed the same type of mental chaos that I was suffering from, trying to make this synthetic Frankensteinian water project monster look real, desperately trying to make the code run faster, to speed up the workflow. It ends up like this nightmare, where you're trying to grab a ball, and just as you're about to grab it, it disappears and moves just outside of reach. He ends the video with a disclaimer that it isn't quite done yet. Just a couple more things that need to be fixed, and that'll all be fine. No, it won't. It never will. 6-year project failure. One common misconception about a big project, like one lasting 6 years and involving many people, compared to the 2-week hobby project with just myself, is that the bigger project is somehow more fail-safe, because there's such a big budget and all these fancy people with fancy titles and salaries. When you're starting your career, you get into the workplace with this idealistic mindset that people handle projects in a professional, competent way. But I've repeatedly found myself in situations where the amount of project mismanagement and incompetence is shocking. The craziest thing about this particular 6-year project is that both the main managers, Bob and Bill, are in denial that the project is even a failure. In their corrupted worldview, failure doesn't even exist. Bob loves to talk about his stories. It's like the new Scrum Sprint or whatever Agile BS is in these days. The thing about the story, it always wraps reality in this positive, improvement-minded coding, when what is actually needed is someone screaming into his face, "Stop what you're doing right now." Some background on this project. In the beginning, I worked with this project for a big tech company as a software engineer, but my whole floor was suddenly and randomly fired, as happens sometimes in big tech companies. And Bob, who was my manager there, created the spin-off startup with the same project, and I also ended up in this startup as an industrial PhD student. As an industrial PhD student, you only work 20% for the company. The remaining 80% is spent at a university doing research towards a PhD degree, in computer science in my case. This may seem like a bad deal for the company, and they essentially lose an employee. But the reason it's still done sometimes is that there are these big grants for tech-related research, and we got one of those. So I found myself in a PhD program, 80%, and so I went to the university, and the first few weeks there were spectacularly disappointing. My university supervisor a newly hired professor, Bill, was only going to give me like a 1 hour meeting every 2 weeks. Okay, but anyways, who cares how often we meet? He's going to kick off a research project, right? No, he didn't do anything. He didn't introduce me to anyone else who's doing research and ask that I help out. He could have said on day one, you're going to proofread this paper written by these other PhD students and finish the subsection on related work. Maybe you'll have to read a couple of other papers to be able to do it. And then you'll be co-author on the paper. No. In fact, during my whole PhD, he didn't find me a single collaborator. Instead, all that was happening in this meeting we had every 2 weeks was that I explained what I was working on at the company. And it dawned on me that Bill knows barely anything about that topic. It was about the optimization of certain processes in factories. And this unfortunately also made him upset. And he took that out on me. Meeting after meeting, I repeated what I worked on, and he got upset because he doesn't understand and blames me for not explaining it well enough. After I explain it, he forgets what I said, and next meeting we start again. I'm not saying that I was or am good at explaining things, but when you start a PhD, you should expect your supervisor to know a lot about your topic. But my supervisor didn't, and he also didn't read up on it. After about 3 months, the level of toxicity was at an all-time high, but we finally did have a productive meeting where me, him, and my co-supervisor wrote down some math equations on the whiteboard. After the meeting, I wrote down these equations in a draft of a paper where the title basically says formulation of the problem. I'm not going to go into detail, but so I was working on this paper draft, and then I started sharing the draft back to Bill and my co-supervisor, and they ignored it or berated it. Finally, I finished the paper and write down myself as main author and Bill and my co-supervisor as co-authors on it and submit it to a conference. And it gets accepted for publication. Just to repeat this, my first PhD paper I submitted behind the backs of my supervisors because I didn't dare to tell them. I was afraid that they'd express disgust at even the idea, that it wasn't good enough, that they didn't want their professor titles polluted by this low-quality work. They did then proofread it before it got published though, and to their cred, they didn't complain about me putting myself as first author on it. I've heard that it's fairly common in academia that professors insist on putting themselves as first authors on papers where they didn't contribute. But they didn't do that, and after the paper got published, Bill actually became less toxic towards me. Publishing is like what closing a big deal is when working for a company. Money isn't a big thing in academia, so publishing is a form of currency there. So things got better, but the lack of meaningful contributions from Bill's side during my whole PhD was still staggering. There was one subsequent paper that I wrote, submitted, and got published, and I'm pretty sure he never read it, even after it got published. But it could have been worse. I shared office with some of Bill's other PhD students. These were normal academic PhD students, and compared to me, Bill was closely involved in their work. When I listened to their stories, I felt like I dodged a bullet. The only thing worse than being the forgotten employee is to have someone like Bill getting actively involved in what you're working on. So these poor guys were forced by Bill to work with a certain system that had been developed by two of Bill's former PhD students that worked under him at his previous university. And although these two former PhD students weren't around at the new university, Bill was completely sold on the system and wanted everyone to use it. But unfortunately, that wasn't a good idea. The first red flag was, if you want to lock your team into using some random system developed by two guys, you really want those two guys to be in-house, to maintain it and update it. No one was maintaining the system, and so obviously it gets deprecated, and everyone on the floor knows it, but Bill doesn't see the problem. Another red flag was the documentation in the system. On a 1 to 5 grade scale, I'd give the documentation of the system a 2. Like it has a README and some tutorials, but they're not adequate given the size of the system. There was some support for the system. There was this one PhD student who was a very low abstraction level guy. He just gets stuff to work on a low level, regardless of the bigger picture. So whenever he ran into a problem with the system, he would either fix it himself and do a pull request, or get in touch directly with those two former PhD guys and make sure they fix it. You always have these loyal, low abstraction level pragmatic workers in an office. But all of Bill's other PhD students, including me, we all unanimously hated this system. I didn't really have to use it because I was an outsider, but I really felt it for these poor other guys who are stuck there, debugging this deprecated, poorly documented system whose authors aren't around. It's just a total failure in project management, and Bill's the one who's ultimately responsible. No one probably ever dared to tell him directly, and in a sick way, it kind of makes sense that no one told him. The type of feedback that he deserved is not constructive. It's the feedback that says, you don't have a grasp of what's going on around you. You're in charge of a Kafkaesque farce. This just hurts me on such a deep level. I can barely use words that I perhaps should use, like incompetence, because I don't want to admit to myself that I was stuck in a place like that for 5 years. Meanwhile, at the company, things weren't much better, but I only worked there 20%, so it didn't matter that much. Bob, the CEO, is as delusional as Bill, but in a different way. And in Bob's defense, his habitat is the startup ecosystem, and you should expect things to be a bit crazy there. It's a brutal world where nice guys don't survive. Bob's big delusion is that he wants to be CEO, but he really isn't CEO material, and it's because of a pretty tragic reason. He has bad manners, and this is absolutely crippling for a startup because it means that relations with customers or investors are doomed from the start. When I went with Bob to meetings with potential customers, he starts by giving this pretty decent sales pitch, and then the potential customer proceeds to ask questions. But before each question can be finished, Bob rudely cuts it off and starts talking. Like, you know, when you try to ask a question and the person interrupts and starts talking over you. It's okay if it happens once or twice when the question is completely bonkers, but here it wasn't, and Bob was still doing it all the time. But his bad manners is really a combination of many subtle things. When Bob drives a car, for example, he's one of those pricks who goes in the bus lane, elbowing himself forward. So we're driving to a conference and make a stop at McDonald's. After we'd finished our meal, I grabbed my tray to go and throw my trash in a bin. Just leave it, Bob says. I look at him, confounded, and put my tray back at the table. He's the boss, but it left a bad taste in my mouth. Is he trying to educate me or something? Like, leaving the trash at the table is one thing, but telling someone else not to throw it is what really says something about who Bob is. When meeting customers in a startup, you really don't want someone like that at the helm. As I was sitting in these meetings with the customers, I repeatedly felt that they had the same feeling I had, this scent of slight disgust and disrespect in the air. But just like in Bill's case, how do you tell your boss about these types of things? How do you tell your boss they have bad manners? It's like asking your boss today if they wouldn't like to fire or at least reprimand you today. In hindsight though, doing nothing over 6 years is even worse. Walking around with such thoughts just cannot last. I wasn't going to get away with it. The last 2 years, I could feel my mental health taking a beating. I learned firsthand that working under bosses that you don't like can be very damaging, especially if you come from a complex upbringing where you lacked strong role models. You go to start your career, subconsciously looking for bosses that can be a role model to you, to lead by example, and this is what you get. In reality, the world out there is pretty cold, and you cannot always expect to find yourself in environments that bring out your best self. You cannot expect your boss to be like Keating in Dead Poet Society. There's always been this battle between conformists and non-conformists, and whether we like it or not, the default state is that of conformism. Most workplaces throughout history have been for conformists who do their job in grim silence without asking questions. There just aren't that many non-conformists around that are willing to break an organization for a new organization that is only potentially going to be any better. Optimization equals das Nichts. I certainly wasn't brave enough to resist. I just saw myself as a foot soldier in all this, obeying orders. I also think the specific topic of my project, so process optimization in factories, requires a form of strength that I lack. And I'm not talking about dealing with the irony in trying to optimize other businesses when your own business is rotten inside. Thing is, the optimization topic itself is pretty heavy. Working with it 40 hours per week, you start seeing everything as something in need of optimization. Optimization is actually a bit negative. It's related to things like downsizing or downscaling. Since this project was about software, optimization and specifically software includes a lot of removal of bad code. And this type of removal mindset can turn inward if you're not careful. You start looking at this broken code base that is your own life. You start thinking about how to optimize it. Is this part of my life really necessary? Do I really need a car, a house, a family, or social activities whose benefit cannot be quantified? After 6 years, this isn't a joke anymore. Ultimate optimization means the removal of everything. I have a bed, a chair, and a table. I don't even have cable internet. Online gaming and TV were put in the waste of time category. They were optimized away a long time ago. After I moved into this trailer I'm currently living in, I thought that it was just going to be temporary, that I would grow out of it. Instead, it became my platonic cave. The person you're listening to right now is an example of someone who is unhireable. Usually, the term unhireable is used in the context of recruitment. The recruiter tells the applicant that they're lacking the necessary skills, that they aren't fit for the position. They're unhireable within the context of the position in question. But I am unhireable in general at this point. I'm coming from a wasteland of brutal enlightenment, a nuclear annihilation of the type of smooth mingling required for recruitment, and the smooth little white lies it involves. These days, brutal honesty is all I can do. Do you have references? The recruiter asks me. No, I'm not in the mood to ask Bob and Bill. I'm sure they'd put in a word for me because I never told them the truth. It's not the same thing as lying. But asking them for references now, I'd be admitting to myself that they're still my superiors, that I needed them. Okay, but are you a team player? After ranting about Bob and Bill, you might think that I'm one of those salty nerds who resent their lower IQ coworkers. But that's not true. Bob and Bill's IQ aren't that high, but neither is mine. The high IQ math genius is something else. I had both friends and enemies of this type. My teacher in statistical machine learning, for example. He would give us these assignments with this code with blank sections that we had to simply fill in. And afterwards, he would act surprised at our submissions, saying that all that was needed was this simple one-liner, instead of these bloated for loops that people like me would submit. He probably had Asperger's. He couldn't understand why his code was difficult to understand. It's kind of tragicomic how a lot of IT is guarded by these types of gatekeepers. They're really smart, but at the same time, stupid. Mediocrity. One of the last things Bill told me was that I should write a book. And I did think about it, but if I write a book, it wouldn't be on process optimization in factories like he wants. Rather, I'd call it mediocre, because everything about me is mediocre. Let's see if somebody has beat me to it. Fuck. Mediocre. The dangerous legacy of white male America? It's got a good rating. After the election of Donald Trump and the escalation of white male rage and increased hostility, white men's deliberate efforts to subvert women, people of color, and the disenfranchised. Okay, so it's about racism. There's definitely such a thing as white mediocrity. At my university, there are these introductory parties on campus at the start of each semester, and it's like only white people and a few Asians. These kids don't see any problem in this partying, but all I see is this white trash college mediocrity. They all listen to the same mediocre music, watch the same mediocre TV. They're being groomed for this mediocre future where they all buy the same junk and work in the same office. Meanwhile, in the neighboring town, I went to a cafe where everyone was working class and also very few white people. It's just a totally different vibe. And connecting it to the point of the book, as I read it, is that these types of communities aren't represented on the technical campus. Until they are, that whole campus environment is mediocre. It's like, regardless of what these white kids do, they're all mediocre, like structurally speaking. On a more personal level, my grandfather is a good example of a mediocre person. His big passions were to write and paint, and he never really got recognized. The last 3 decades of his life, he lived in this massive mansion. He married a rich woman, and most of this mansion was an art studio and an art gallery. I loved running around there as a kid. It had a bit of a Fanny and Alexander magic to it, but more groundy. My grandfather and his wife were heavy pipe smokers. They were sitting in the living room in these massive throne-like chairs in front of this analog television set, lighting up their pipes. On the walls hang their kitsch paintings. They've been hanging there for decades, and they are for sale because they never officially stopped trying to sell them. But no one wants to buy them because they look like shit. They're covered in the same layers of filth as the walls and carpets, not just because of the pipe smoke. Part of the mansion had previously been used as a massive cat sanctuary, adding a sour ooze to the general atmosphere. They also had this dog, Bruno, that they couldn't take properly care of. He was always dirty. So weird how your childhood years affect how you become. I feel the same way about bad art as I do about a dog that hasn't been properly taken care of. It's revolting on a physical level. At the mansion entrance, there was a reception room with this big desk, and my grandfather's books are piled up there. He didn't have much more luck with them than his art. He most definitely paid to get them printed himself. Hundreds of copies, just piled up. His ego was so big that he probably didn't care that he couldn't sell them. It was him against the world. But he didn't flinch. He didn't care about any opinions of others. He kept doing his thing. It was just part of his DNA to write books that nobody wants to read. Manuscripts do burn. Part of my grandfather's library was made up of comics. Prince Valiant was one of them. I remember the storyline about some Frankish tribe that had been expelled from their homeland. And then, many years later, a group of followers came back on some Viking ship to reclaim it from their conqueror. After they land on the beach, the leader sets fire to the ship and holds this speech, saying there won't be any turning back now. This scene has stuck with me, and when I first read it as a kid, I felt pretty annoyed by it. Why set fire to the ship when it could be used for supplies or sold for money? But as I grew older, I realized the importance of the symbolism of this act. By burning the ship, the leader showed that he is committed to the point of mania, and this is something that would have a significant impact on a lot of his followers. Because most followers are just normal, mediocre, conformist people that don't care much about anything. But then suddenly their only safe place is being lit by this big fire. They go through the stages, shock, anger, disbelief, followed by this massive speech by the leader. The lesson is that for most of us, bravery doesn't come naturally. In order to even have a chance at being slightly touched by it, we need to be shook up in some way. And seeing something that is valuable to you burn is one way to do it. So, I'm going to delete this Wave project now. Why not just put the code in storage, idiot? Well, it just so happens to be that this manuscript needs to burn. This "manuscripts do not burn" quote comes from Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita novel. Set in Stalin Russia, the secret agents break into the author's apartment and throw his manuscripts in the fire, but they won't burn, because they stubbornly live on in the mind of the author. But what if the author wants his work to burn? What if he feels relief when the agents storm in? Finally, someone to talk to. Bring me to the penal colony. Salvation through work, as they say. Or death. That is also fine. Isn't that what Dostoevsky got? Certain death followed by gulag. With a Bible? Send me. But just don't send me with a Bible. Send me with this mediocrity white male America book. Let me live with only that book for 6 years. Behold, it is cast into the fire for fuel. The fire devoureth both ends of it, and the midst of it is burned. This quote comes from Moses and the burning bush, and there the symbol mainly focuses on the power of fire itself, how it's the ultimate manifestation of something that is changing or that is going to change. So there are a lot of references to the same message. There is the bonfire of the vanities. That was an official event in Florence, 1497, where manuscripts and paintings that were deemed vain by the church were burnt, because they depicted nudity or other sins. We don't know whether the creators of the works sometimes volunteered to do it, or even who exactly participated. But it is an interesting thought that a great painter like Botticelli would carry one of his masterpieces to the bonfire with confidence and feel good about burning it. Another one is this movie Wonder Boys, and there's this author played by Michael Douglas who loses his manuscript by accident because he only had one copy and it falls out of a car and blows away into some lake. The manuscript there is depicted almost like a parasite, and the author gets unburdened by it. He pretty quickly realizes that losing it was for the best. So there are many ways that manuscripts can burn. Either the state can burn it, or at least attempt to burn it, or it can be burned purposely by the author, or it can burn by accident. But similar to all is that there is this weird, positive, cathartic element in the burning. Conclusion. Before I step out, I turn around and look back at the salt mine. There is the bonfire of the vanities, memories of Bob and Bill, a hall of mirrors that takes in all that I said and reflects back this image of myself as just another mediocre person. As I finally get out, I feel this fresh gust of air in my face. That was rough. It's not easy to talk about negative things. Nobody wants to be this negative, whiny person. Standing outside, the many positive things with the projects and people I talked about come back. The things I didn't bring up here because they were the things that I didn't have any problem disclosing every day over the last 6 years. Positivity that dominates most workplaces, and also presentations of hobby projects. But failure is just around the corner, and the question is how you choose to deal with it. This time, I choose to let all the salt accumulate over 6 years and deal with it like this, posting it in an unknown corner of the internet. Bob and Bill, whose real names are something different, will most likely never find this place. But if they do, here's what I have to say. We'll probably never meet again, so don't take it personally, and maybe you can use this as an opportunity to grow. Try to project more security around you so that people feel safe enough to bring up their true thoughts and feelings to you. That would make both you and the people around you stronger.